911, where's your emergency? My baby's not breathing. He's not breathing at all. That call came from a house in Bellefontaine, Ohio, a small town, maybe 10,000 people. Logan County, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where bad news travels before the ambulance does, and where a baby dying is the worst thing most people can imagine happening on their street. The baby on that call was 3 months old. His name was Niall, and within 13 months of his death, 2 more boys from the exact same house would stop breathing. 3 sons, 1 mother, 13 months. And somehow, the police, the doctors, the courts, and children's services all watched this unfold in slow motion and did almost nothing until it was far too late. This isn't just a story about a woman who killed her children. If it were, it would be horrifying enough on its own. But this case goes deeper than that, and in directions most people don't expect. Because the woman who confessed to smothering 3 boys wasn't some stranger who wandered into motherhood unprepared. She was a product shaped and molded by a predatory marriage, a poisoned childhood, and a system that had every reason to intervene and never did. This is the story of Brittany Pilkington. And to understand how 3 children died under her care, you have to understand the world she came from, because that world is what made this tragedy not just possible, but almost inevitable. Brittany grew up in a home that, from the outside, probably didn't raise many alarms. But when she was 9 years old, her mother began a relationship with a man named Joseph Pilkington. He moved into the household. He became a father figure to Brittany and her siblings. He was the adult male presence in the home, the authority, the person a child in that position would naturally look to for guidance and stability. And for a while, maybe that's what it looked like. A blended family finding its footing. But over time, the relationship between Joseph and Brittany shifted. It didn't happen overnight. It rarely does in cases like this. Grooming is a slow process. It's built on trust, on proximity, on gradually eroding the boundaries between caretaker and something else entirely. By the time Brittany was a teenager, Joseph had transitioned from stepfather to romantic partner. She was pregnant by 17. They were married by 18. He was significantly older. And the power dynamic between them wasn't ambiguous. It was the textbook definition of a grooming cycle. A man in a position of authority and trust over a child, systematically breaking down the wall between parental care and sexual control, until the child doesn't even have the framework to recognize what's been done to her. Brittany's biological father, Ed Cummins, saw it happening. He said so publicly, and he said it with frustration that was years in the making. According to Cummins, he contacted Children's Services well before any of the murders took place to report what he called an inappropriate relationship between Joseph and his daughter. He raised the alarm. He told the people whose job it was to protect children that something was deeply wrong in that household. And in his words, nothing ever got done. No investigation that changed anything. No removal. No intervention that pulled Brittany out of Joseph's orbit. She stayed in that house, stayed in that relationship, and eventually walked down the aisle with the man who had been her stepfather since she was in elementary school. And Joseph's history makes this even harder to stomach. He wasn't some guy with a clean record and a questionable relationship. He had been charged with sexual battery. He was a registered sex offender. This information was not buried. It was on the record, accessible to anyone in the system who cared to look. And yet, no one with the authority to act used that information to intervene in his marriage to a woman he had groomed from childhood. No one blocked him from raising children. No one flagged the household as high risk based on his documented history. The system knew who Joseph Pilkington was, and the system let him build a family anyway. Brittany's mother played a role here too, and it's one that often gets overlooked. She allowed the marriage. She was the adult who brought Joseph into the home in the first place, and she was the adult who either endorsed or failed to prevent her daughter's transition from stepdaughter to wife. Her complicity, whether active or passive, is part of the scaffolding that held this entire situation together. Brittany didn't have a single adult in her life who protected her from what was happening. Not her mother, not children's services, not the legal system. She was surrounded by people and institutions that could have changed the course of her life, and every single one of them either looked away or decided it wasn't their problem. Now, the murders. Niall Pilkington was born in 2014. By all available accounts, he was a healthy baby. There were no immediate medical red flags, no congenital conditions that suggested he was fragile or at risk. But in July of 2014, at just 3 months old. Niall was found unresponsive in the home. Emergency services were called. He was transported to the hospital, and he didn't survive. The cause of death was classified in the realm of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, or more broadly as undetermined or unexplained. That classification carries enormous weight in pediatric medicine and in law enforcement, because it essentially means the medical examiner couldn't identify a specific mechanism of death, no obvious trauma, no clear toxicology findings, no smoking gun. So the death was catalogued, grief was expressed, and the family went home. 9 months later, in April of 2015, Gavin Pilkington died. He was 4 years old, and this is where the pattern should have become impossible to ignore. SIDS is, by definition, a diagnosis associated with infants, typically babies under 1 year of age. A 4-year-old dying suddenly and without explanation in the same household where an infant died under nearly identical circumstances less than a year earlier is not a coincidence that any medical or legal professional should have been comfortable with. 2 unexplained deaths of children in the same home involving the same parents within 9 months of each other. That's not bad luck. That's a pattern. And patterns like that demand a response that goes far beyond classifying and filing. To its credit, the system did respond, partially. After Gavin's death, Children's Services stepped in and removed the remaining children from the Pilkington household, including the youngest son, Noah. That was the right call. Someone within the system recognized the accumulating risk and decided that those children could not safely remain in that home, while 2 unexplained deaths hung in the air. For a brief window, the system worked, and then it reversed itself. A custody hearing was scheduled. It lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, evidence, and legal argument about whether Brittany and Joseph Pilkington should have their children returned to them. And at the end of those 3 days, the judge ruled in the parents' favor. The children were sent back. The reasoning, as best as the public record reflects, was that the evidence did not meet the legal threshold required to justify continued removal. There's a standard that has to be met in these proceedings. You can't indefinitely separate parents from their children based solely on suspicion. But the circumstances here were extraordinary by any measure. 2 dead children, both deaths unexplained. The same household, the same parents, a registered sex offender as the father, and critically, both parents reportedly refused to undergo psychological evaluations during the hearing. They wouldn't submit to the very assessments that might have provided the court with the information it needed to make a fully informed decision, and the court returned the children anyway. What exactly happened in that hearing? What evidence was presented and what wasn't? What arguments did the attorneys make? What weight did the judge give to the parents' refusal to be evaluated? These are questions that the public record does not fully answer, and they matter more than almost anything else in this case, because what happened next is directly traceable to that ruling. 6 days after the children were returned, Noah Pilkington was dead. 6 days. That's the margin. That's how close the system came to preventing a 3rd death. Close enough to have had the children physically out of the home and in protective custody. And how completely it failed when it mattered most. Noah was an infant. Brittany smothered him the same way she had smothered his brothers, and it was only after this 3rd death that law enforcement finally moved to arrest her. The interrogation that followed produced a confession, and the details of that confession are as disturbing as anything else in this case. Brittany told investigators that she had smothered all 3 boys using blankets. She described the method plainly, and when asked why would a mother kill her own children, she gave an answer that is difficult to fully absorb. She said she was jealous of the attention Joseph gave to the boys. She said she wanted Joseph to focus on her, to pay attention to her instead of the children, and she said she wanted him to feel pain. She killed their sons so that Joseph would suffer, and so that his attention would return to where she believed it belonged, on her. That motive sounds almost alien in its cruelty. But place it inside the context of her relationship with Joseph and it takes on a different, more disturbing shape. This was a woman whose entire psychological world had been organized around one man since she was 9 years old, a man who had trained her, deliberately or not, to center her existence on his attention and approval. When that attention shifted to their children, she didn't experience it the way a healthy parent would. She experienced it as abandonment, as a threat, as a loss of the only thing she'd ever been conditioned to value. The grooming didn't just damage her childhood. It warped her understanding of love, attachment, and motherhood into something so distorted that her own sons became rivals. None of that excuses what she did, not even close. But it does make the case far more complicated than the simple evil mother narrative that headlines tend to favor. And then there's the science, because Brittany Pilkington's brain was not a normal brain. And the evidence for that is not speculative, it's medical. Brittany suffered from childhood lead poisoning. Lead exposure in children, particularly chronic exposure at high levels, causes permanent and measurable damage to the developing brain. It attacks the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation. It reduces cognitive function across the board, and it does not heal. The damage is done during development, and it persists for life. Brittany's IQ was formally tested at 78. That places her in the borderline range of intellectual functioning, not profoundly disabled, but operating with significantly fewer cognitive resources than the average adult. She could function in daily life. She could carry on conversations, take care of basic tasks, maintain a household on a surface level, but her ability to process complex emotional situations, to foresee consequences, to resist pressure, all of that was compromised in ways that a standard IQ number doesn't fully capture. Her defense team went further than the IQ score. They arranged for a PET scan, a positron emission tomography scan that measures metabolic activity in the brain, showing which regions are functioning normally and which are not. The results were significant. The scan revealed physical damage to the right hemisphere of Brittany's brain. Not a subtle finding, not a borderline result. Visible, measurable structural impairment consistent with the kind of injury that chronic lead exposure inflicts on developing neural tissue. Medical experts who reviewed the scan argued that this damage explained two key aspects of Brittany's behavior: her flat emotional affect, the detached, almost vacant quality that made her appear cold and unfeeling during interviews and court appearances, was not, they claimed, evidence of psychopathy or callousness. It was a neurological deficit. Her brain physically lacked the capacity to produce the full range of emotional responses that a healthy brain generates. She wasn't choosing not to feel. She couldn't feel, at least not in the way most people understand that word. And her behavior during interrogation, her readiness to confess, her failure to assert her rights, her apparent inability to resist the pressure of sustained police questioning, was similarly linked to her cognitive limitations. A person with an IQ of 78 and documented right hemisphere brain damage does not engage with a police interrogation on equal footing. The power imbalance is massive, and it raises real questions about the reliability and voluntariness of her confession. This is where the case bumps up against a legal frontier that most true crime coverage doesn't touch. It's called neurolaw, the emerging and deeply controversial practice of using neuroimaging evidence in criminal proceedings, particularly in sentencing and mitigation. The core question is straightforward, but its implications are enormous. If a defendant's brain is physically damaged in a way that demonstrably impairs their judgment, their impulse control, or their capacity to understand the full weight of their actions, does that change how we should punish them? Should brain scans carry weight in a courtroom the same way DNA evidence does? And if so, where do you draw the line between explanation and excuse? Brittany's case sits right in the middle of that debate. Her defense did not argue that she was innocent. She confessed. The question was whether her damaged brain, combined with a lifetime of grooming and psychological manipulation, reduced her moral culpability to a degree that should affect her sentence. The prosecution pushed back hard. They pointed to the pattern: 3 deaths over 13 months. This wasn't a single impulsive act committed in a moment of emotional crisis. It was repeated. She killed Niall, and then months later she killed Gavin, and then months after that, she killed Noah. The prosecution argued that repetition implies choice. It implies a conscious decision, made not once but 3 times, to take a child's life. They initially pursued death specifications, meaning the state of Ohio considered seeking the death penalty. That was eventually taken off the table. But the fact that it was ever on the table tells you how the prosecution viewed Brittany's actions, not as the tragic byproduct of a broken mind, but as deliberate, repeated murder. The trial ended in conviction. Brittany Pilkington was sentenced to 37 years to life in prison. Under that sentence, she won't be eligible for parole until she's well into her 70s. After sentencing, her defense attorney made a remark that has stayed with people who followed this case closely. He said Brittany is safer living a better life in jail than on the outside. Sit with that for a second. Her own lawyer, the one person in the courtroom whose entire job was to advocate for her freedom, looked at the world she came from and concluded that a prison cell was an improvement. That tells you something about what her life outside those walls actually looked like, about what Joseph Pilkington's presence meant, about what home had always been for her. And speaking of Joseph, the question of what happened to him is one that generates more frustration than almost any other aspect of this case. He was a registered sex offender. He had sexual battery charges on his record. He groomed a 9-year-old girl, turned her into his wife, fathered 3 children with her, and, if you take Brittany's confession at face value, his behavior was the driving force behind her motive to kill. And his legal consequences? A suspended sentence, no meaningful prison time, no outcome that remotely corresponds to the scale of damage his actions caused. Brittany is serving 37 years. Joseph walked away. For a lot of people, that disparity is the single most enraging element of this entire case. The failures here are not abstract. They are specific, sequential, and documented. A biological father reports an inappropriate relationship between his minor daughter and her adult stepfather. Nothing meaningful happens. A registered sex offender marries the girl he groomed. No one intervenes. A baby dies under unexplained circumstances. The death is classified and filed. A second child dies in the same home under similar circumstances. Concern is raised, children are removed, and then a judge returns them after 3 days. A third child dies less than a week later. Each one of these is a decision point, a moment where a caseworker, a judge, a doctor, or a prosecutor could have changed the outcome. And at every single point, the system chose the path of least resistance. It chose inaction. It chose the benefit of the doubt. It chose to wait for more evidence, more certainty, more dead children before it acted. There's a principle in child welfare called the accumulation of concern. It means that no single piece of information might justify drastic intervention on its own, but the pattern, the buildup, should trigger a response that individual data points never would. The Pilkington case is a catastrophic failure of that principle. Each death was treated as a standalone event. Each time, the medical and legal systems reset the clock instead of connecting the dots. And by the time the pattern became undeniable, Noah was already gone. Brittany Pilkington is in prison. Her 3 sons are buried. Joseph Pilkington faced minimal consequences for his role in creating the conditions that led to their deaths. The judge who returned those children to their mother 6 days before the 3rd murder has not, to public knowledge, faced any accountability for that decision. Children's Services has not released a full accounting of how its process broke down at multiple stages. The biological father, who tried to raise the alarm years earlier, has been left with the knowledge that he saw it coming, and no one listened. And the broader question, the one that extends beyond Bellefontaine, Ohio, beyond this one family, remains unresolved. What do we do when brain damage, grooming, and systemic negligence converge in a single person? When the killer is also a victim? When the confession is real, but the mind behind it was compromised before it ever had a fair chance? Neuro law is still in its early stages. Courts are still figuring out what to do with PET scans and IQ scores and histories of lead poisoning, and cases like Brittany Pilkington's are the ones that will eventually force those answers, because they refuse to fit neatly into the categories we already have. Her defense called it a broken brain. The prosecution called it murder. The court called it 37 years to life. But the people who tried to raise the alarm before any of those boys were born, the father who called Children's Services, the neighbors who watched a teenage girl walk down the aisle with the man who raised her, they'd probably use a different word. They'd call it preventable. And that might be the hardest part of this whole case to sit with. Not that it happened, but that it didn't have to. This is where we close today's story. If you want more cases explored with this level of detail, hit subscribe and stay connected. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, goodbye and good night.